Right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you everyone who's online now for joining us. Umar Munshi here, and I'll introduce our guest for today in a short while. Before that, I'll talk about myself as usual. This is our monthly seminar, our monthly webinar for Ethis Crowd. We have it every last Wednesday of the month, every month, inshallah. And this is the fourth installment. Already, or fourth installment of our webinar. And alhamdulillah, today we have a very interesting topic, and inshallah a lot of interesting things to talk about. Just very quickly, Ethis Crowd is focused on Islamic crowdfunding. We have our main platform, of course, is Ethis Crowd, focused on impact investment, mainly in Indonesia for social housing. Alhamdulillah, we have some very good track record there and proof of concept in that space. We are also pushing the boundaries of what we do, and 2019 will be an exciting year for us. But today it's not about us. Today is about this topic, a very important topic about the Sustainable Development Goals. And with us today we have Mr. Daud Vicary, Abdullah, someone that I've learned a lot from and I hope to learn a lot from even more in the future, inshallah. Mr. Daud Vicary has had a long career in finance, about 45 years in finance, and 30 of those years is in Islamic finance. And today, semi-retired but more busy. He is also actively involved in various organizations and institutions. I'll maybe let Mr. Daud explain a little bit more, share a little bit more about his background before we jump into the topic for today.
Okay, fine. Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Umar. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good day to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for listening in. I wanted to share some thoughts on the topic of Islamic finance, or the role of Islamic finance in achieving the SDGs. But first, for those of you who don't know me, or those of you who do know me but want to find out a little more, just a bit of background on me. I always think of myself actually as an accidental tourist in Islamic finance and in Islam. And it did start about 30 years ago when I was working on a project in Malaysia, which is where we're speaking from. And the central bank had initiated one Bank Islam in 1983. In the early 90s, there was a move to do two things: grant a second banking license, and also to encourage, and by the word encourage I think mean issue a rule to say you will do this, Islamic windows to be opened. And I was informed of this news during a project steering committee meeting at the bank where I was doing a project. And one of the board members who sat on the project steering committee said, well, you're the banking expert, you tell us what we have to do to open an Islamic window. And I rather facetiously made a comment about Islamic architecture and announced I knew absolutely nothing about Islamic finance. And the instruction I got was to go out and find out about it. And I was extremely fortunate in that I was able to find somebody who was able to explain it to me over many long coffees and taterics over the following 2 or 3 months. And the rest, as they say, is history. But I was completely there by accident and just decided to say yes. Let me link that with not the rest of my career, because we'll spend the rest of the day talking about that, and that's not the intention. But at that point, I did decide to make a change. I converted to Islam pretty soon afterwards. And I also started working on trying to understand Islamic finance a lot better. And I was very, very fortunate, and here is the link to the SDGs, although nobody knew what they were back in the early 90s. I was very impressed by the people who educated me, because at that time there were no courses or programs or university lectures or much about Islamic banking or Islamic finance. There was a fair amount about Islamic economics, but it seemed very disjointed from the real world. So most of what I learned was from, former practitioners or practitioners who could speak my language, which was conventional finance and accounting, and could explain things to me in a particular way that started to make some sense. And I was very, very impressed by what I call now the duty of care that these individuals demonstrated. What came across to me in my early days of education in the subject matter was this element of the duty of care. And let me explain that to you as simply as I can, because I think it's important. It's important you understand how I got to this point, but it may be a useful point of reference, for each of you. The duty of care is really, when you're asked a question, you have a duty of care to answer if you know the answer. You can't sort of shut off and say, I'm not going to answer your question, or you look the wrong color, or I don't like the look of your face, or you're not a Muslim, and therefore I'm not going to answer the question. Everybody I asked who had some knowledge of Islamic finance was more than willing to share. In fact, they were extremely willing to share and made a huge effort to help educate me, because I showed some interest. And I remember asking one of my mentors many years later, and this is a mentor who I'm still in touch with and who still mentors me. I asked him, why did you do this? And he actually explained it and said it was our duty of care. It was our duty of care to answer the questions you had. We knew you were sincere by the way you were asking them. And, with benefit of hindsight, he said, look what you've achieved. All that bit of effort I put into explaining the basics of how Islamic finance worked and how it related to Islam, look what you've been able to do with it. And all I try to do now is to continue in the same way. And that is, I have a duty of care to help educate or share the knowledge that I have accumulated over what is almost 30 years in the industry, and to help share with you. So let me now focus on the SDGs and Islamic finance and the role on this. And you may see a slide there of the 17 SDGs. It won't be a test of memory for me. I always remember two in particular. I remember 1 and 2, which is no poverty and zero hunger. Number 5, which is one I'm very fond of, is gender equality. But I also think, and I was asked this question quite recently in an interview in Dubai, what I thought was the most important. And I said number 17, the partnerships for the goals, which is about collaboration, because I think without collaboration, we're unlikely to achieve any of the other 16. But I digress slightly. Let me share with you what I hope is a relevant story about the SDGs. And you may recall that the SDGs actually were built on something called the Millennium Development Goals, which weren't 17. I actually forget the number now, but it wasn't as many as 17. But they had a broad similarity to this and were reasonably successful in their implementation. And the intention was to get them implemented by the year 2000. It took a number of years for the United Nations and others to draw conclusions about the success and to come up with a new plan. But they launched these 17 Sustainable Development Goals only a few years ago. And I recall being asked to go to a meeting of UNDP in Dubai. And I believe it was in the summer, I think it was June or July, it was the hot time of year in Dubai, of 2016. So we're only talking about 2.5 years ago. And one of the key speakers at the conference was the recently retired governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia, Dr. Siti Aziz. And she, as you may know, is a patron and a founder of something called the Responsible Finance and Investment Foundation, the RFI Foundation, of which I'm a founding trustee. And she asked me to come along. And then at that time, I was president and CEO of INSIF, the Global University of Islamic Finance. And she asked me to attend because there were going to be some workshops after the plenary session where she felt there was a need to get into some more detail about the role that Islamic finance could play in achieving desired outcomes under these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm about halfway through this story if you're watching the time on this. Anyway, the plenary session was extremely interesting. And a little bit of an experiment was done by Dr. Vicary because she looked at the audience and asked the moderator if she could do a small experiment. And she asked how many people in the audience were in fact familiar with the term Islamic finance. And about 10% of the people put their hands up.
This was a general audience.
This is general audience, yes, of people from the United Nations, people from ministries and finance in the Gulf, a lot of people obviously from the UAE and foreign visitors, about 1,000 people in the room. It was a big audience. So about 100 stuck their hands up and said, I've heard of Islamic finance. And then she asked, well, how many of you have a good understanding of what Islamic finance represents? And the 100 people, about 90 of them put their hands down, and about 10 put their hands up and said, we think we understand it. Now, the interrogation finished at that point, but the point that was made in the plenary session was that not that many people who were there to see how they could use the financial services sector effectively to mobilize for achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, very few people, so we're talking about 1% of the audience, had any idea what Islamic finance was, let alone the role it could play. And I remember being quite shocked at those statistics. We were, by the way, in the United Arab Emirates, and it was really quite eye-opening that so few people had even heard of the subject of Islamic finance. So in the workshop sessions which came later, the 1,000 dispersed into, I think, 5 working groups of about 200. We had some casualties. People didn't come back from lunch, so probably there were about 100 people in the room that I was talking to. And my job was to help explain not how Islamic finance was linked to the 17 Sustainable Goals, that came a bit later in the afternoon, but it was just explaining some of the basics of Islamic finance, about the objectives of the Maqasid in terms of, preservation of human life, preservation of faith, intellect, of property and of family, and about those values. And suddenly, and I could say quite suddenly, because it was predominantly, I'd say about 80% of the audience was non-Muslim. The 80% started to sort of understand a little bit that the objectives of Islam did have some alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. When you started talking about things like preservation of life, duty of care, acting as stewards for the planet, talking about property rights, preservation of intellect, looking after the family, making sure that you had good governance around property rights and so on. In the space of 2 or 3 hours that afternoon, I would say the needle shifted from sort of zero comprehension to probably 50% or more comprehension amongst these reasonably influential people that there was some alignment between the objectives of Islam, how Islamic finance represented Islam, and how it could be connected to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And ever since that moment, I've been personally quite committed to promoting this alignment, that the SDGs and the Maqasid are broadly similar. We're not really talking about anything radically different. And what I found, and I think the way you present things is probably, I certainly present things differently from when I first started doing Islamic finance, where I used to go into long diatribes trying to explain how you could run a financial system without using riba, which is not the best place to start because it's terribly complicated when you have a system in the world which is been around for 200 or more years, based on fiat money, and you're basically preaching, radical economics to say we're not actually going to have a financial system which is based on interest. And passing thoughts on the fact that the Ibrahimic faiths all actually don't like usury or riba, and are against it. And most other major religions understand that riba is a no-no, and perhaps the root of most evil in terms of creating economic slavery and so on. But 20, 30 years ago, that was not a conversation you had. I wish we could have had those conversations 20 or 30 years ago. But in recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, that I've been surprised about how much interaction one can have with predominantly non-Muslim audiences all over the world, in helping them understand that Islamic finance is not a threat, it's actually quite a useful tool, and that Islam isn't a threat, it's a useful tool because the value system is very, very similar. They can identify with the value. I'll share with you a piece of data which stuck with me, and the reason it stuck with me is because I used it in a presentation probably about 3 years ago, and it came from the UNDP. And the UNDP did an interesting survey on the Sustainable Development Goals and different generations. So they were looking at the millennial generation, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and whatever generations we've got since then. This is where I put up my hand and say I'm dinosaur, although I think I'm probably baby boomer is probably the right generation to put me in. This survey came up, and it was very comprehensive. It was done in about 150 countries around the world, and it was targeted at young people. I don't know how many thousands participated in it. It was published in the early part of 2016, so I think it must have been done in 2015 or so. And 2 bits of data, and there were masses of data points in this, but 2 bits of data really stuck with me. One bit of data was that the millennial generation and younger, 91% of them, when asked the question, would you invest in any business which was not sustainable or did not comply with ESG standards or had some alignment with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, 91% of the younger people said they would not. 91%. The second number, which hit me because it was almost as high, it was 90%. When asked the question, these same young people answered to this question was, would you wish to be employed, or would you want to be employed by any company or organization that was not identified with meeting the SDGs or was ESG compliant? 90% of them said, no, we wouldn't. So this came at a time when there was a lot of what I call toing and froing in the Islamic finance industry about positioning itself, had we got the messages across. The argument I had was, well, you've got a young generation here who are not necessarily looking at the religious issues, but are certainly looking at the values of sustainability and living, a little bit more frugally in order to, be, both sustainable and to be economically viable. So that was a very, very telling statistic. Now, since then, I now tend to speak quite a bit on the alignment of the Maqasid with the SDGs. I talk about sustainability. I talk about responsible and ethical finance. And I also talk about specific projects that I've been involved in. And we had some questions which I think we asked people to come in early on before we started. And I believe, Umar, we're going to answer questions later. But we're answering some of the questions already, because we picked a few out, and thank you for submitting early questions, which has given us a sort of clue as to the direction that we should be heading in. I wanted to have a stab at answering some of these so that we get them, get them in the right context. So if we push a button, how would Islamic finance be implemented with the SDGs? It's a big question. This came from Indonesia, hopefully not the whole of Indonesia, but somebody in Indonesia, and thank you for this. It's a wonderful question, and I'm going to try and be succinct, but it probably merits many hours of dissertation on this. But Islamic finance, in essence, should be about the SDGs, because if you look at the objectives of the Maqasid, you look at the objectives of the duty of care, if you read the Quran, and I'm sure you do as I do, sadly I don't read it in Arabic, I have to do the English translation, but inshallah one day my Arabic will be good enough. What's interesting, and this I was taught by a very eminent economist and also scholar, Professor Abbas Miracle, and those of you who are in SIF will be familiar with him, and those of you who are familiar with the IMF will be familiar with him. And what he shared, and what I learned and understood, was that if you view the Quran as an economics textbook, I know it's not, but there's quite a lot about economics in there. It really gives you a very clear message that it's not about a supply and demand issue. It does talk about the Yusuf situation where you've got 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and that you should try and balance all of this out. It doesn't really mention, in terms of economics, any problems with regards to supply and demand. It basically said the market will regulate that. There's plenty for everybody, so long as you don't get greedy and you live within your means. Effectively, it's a message. So the message isn't supply and demand in the Quran, it's about equitable, fair distribution. And fair distribution is very much supported, not just by the SDGs, but of course by the Maqasid Shariah. So the implementation, how would it be implemented? I think there are 2, perhaps 3 levels that you should be looking at. The top level is a strategic level, where it's the identification that there is nothing which decouples the objectives of Islam, the Maqasid al-Shariah, and what we do and how we do it as Muslims from achieving the objectives of the SDGs. It's not some strange and wonderful thing that's been created by the UN in New York and has got nothing to do with us. It's actually got everything to do with us, and it always has had something to do with us, because we need to behave responsibly in this environment. So that's one level. The second level is at the institutional level, and let's talk about the financial institutions here. The financial institutions, in particular the Islamic financial institutions, do need, in my opinion, need to be much more focused on achieving the SDGs. In the past, and I as a CEO, a former CEO of Islamic banks, I was as guilty of this as the next man or woman. We tended to follow pretty much what the conventional environment did, and we tried to make money and we lent money, but we didn't really go into thinking that seriously about the social impact of what we were doing, or the environmental impact. That is now changing. Sharia boards, particularly in Malaysia, are becoming more conscious of this, and they're being educated in this way. Boards of directors, again, are being educated in this way. And Bank Negara is running a program now on Islamic finance for boards, of which I'm part. We're trying to portray or inculcate a point of view that it's your responsibility to think about this. You do see conventional banks, Standard Chartered, and I'm sure Standard Chartered Sadiq, and this isn't a shout out for Standard Chartered, it just came to my head, straight into my head, but they've already banned, going forward, they are not lending to any carbon-based industry. So they're not lending to coal extraction, oil extraction, etc., etc. They're actually changing, the way things are done. So as a matter of strategic policy within financial institutions, you're seeing it already from the point of view of asset management and people looking at, is it Sharia compliant, but also is it SDG compliant? And you can look at products like the S-Ray, which have been produced by companies like Arabesque, which Bank Islam here in Malaysia uses, which is looking at all sorts of guidelines using dynamic data and artificial intelligence. It can really clearly tell you whether this is a sustainable business or not. It actually tracks 7,000 plus companies in the world in real time to tell you whether they're actually deviating from the path or not. This would be very useful for Sharia boards. So the second level is that operational level at financial institutions, whether you're lending, whether you are insuring using takaful, or whether you're doing asset management. The third level, I think, comes down to the individual level, where we do actually, as individuals, and I'm not talking here whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, all of us need to have a heightened level of consciousness with regards to the impact of what we do. Now, we can't know everything. I wish, but it isn't going to happen. But we can create a level of awareness where people have some consciousness about decisions that they make and the impact potentially that decision might have. More information, more dissemination of that information, more accessibility to the information, and this is where I should be waving, it's not my phone, but a smartphone. There's all sorts of things out there in terms of applications where you can get information as to whether this will be a smart decision or not, because you're getting that feedback. So I think that's the way I would approach this. Islamic finance is engaged at all three of these levels, very much at a global strategy, at the operational, strategic and tactical level within financial institutions, but also individuals in terms of whether you bank or insure or put your money into these accounts, can make conscious decisions as to whether you put your money there or not. But also, if you have put your money there, you keep the institution honest by saying, we're not happy if you keep investing in coal. Okay, so that I think that first question, a great question, which probably we could have lectures and seminars for the rest of the year on, but let's move on to another question which you asked. How do we get the non-Muslims, especially in Western countries, to accept the idea of Sharia investing in line with SDGs, sustainable, responsible, ethical investing? Well, I think this is already moving forward. You may have heard me a little bit earlier if you were paying attention. And sadly, we can't do an online test to see whether you have been paying attention. But I did comment on this, that there's a much greater level of acceptance within conventional financial institutions and publicly around these shared values of sustainability, responsibility, and ethical values. And therefore, the line of least resistance, which is always a good line to follow, is that many people find it difficult to wrap their heads around Islamic finance from the outset. And for all sorts of reasons, because there's a belief that maybe we have to be a Muslim in order to do Islamic finance, which is still held by many. Many people, there's lots of negativity around Islam and around Islamic finance, and I don't want to dwell on that, but you know exactly what I mean, I'm sure. But these shared values around sustainability and responsibility and ethics, once you get across the values of Islam, and people go, oh, well, I never knew that. One of my favorite examples, which I use, and please forgive me if you've heard this before, but I use it because it is actually very effective, is the concept of waqf, or a trust being created. And whilst there are examples in early history, and I'm going back to Roman times and before, of concepts of trust, the concept of a waqf was really quite powerful. And the power of the waqf was demonstrated when the Crusaders, who went to the Levant to kick all sorts of nonsense out of the Muslims who'd taken over the holy city of Jerusalem, and there were religious wars. But when they returned after one of the Crusades, one of the Crusaders had identified this wonderful concept called an endowment, or a waqf, and decided that he was going to endow the first ever college at the first ever university in England, which was Merton College, Oxford. And the year was 1264. And if you look at Professor Murat Shishashka's research, he's an INSIF professor until he retired a couple of years ago, you will clearly see that the trust deed established to set up that university in England, and it was the first university in England, is actually based on an Islamic waqf. And that became part of English common law, an English common law of trust. An English common law of trust forms the basis of US trust law. And every public university in the US and private university, Harvard included, if you look at their trust deed, it's based on an Islamic waqf. So, you know, I'm not saying we've taken over the world, but what I am saying is that some really smart concepts were recognized at the time as best practices by people who were fighting each other and basically, you know, God's on our side kind of wars, and people had deep religious beliefs about this because they were instructed so. But it didn't stop them bringing back good ideas, and the good ideas came back. So the good ideas are being identified, and I found that we've got a lot more traction through the RFI Foundation and through many others, and particularly when the team went to the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires recently, got huge traction from the Vatican, from the Pope, and from others to say, actually, Islamic finance is very relevant because it does talk about this, and it is very closely aligned. So the answer is it's becoming more accepted, but you've still got to get around the resistance, and the resistance tends to come from people having poor perceptions about Islam and Islamic finance. So we do need to educate there, but it's better to educate through example rather than say, well, it's different because it's like this, and you try to explain it. So you've actually got physical examples of how this worked and how it improved things. Then it really does help. So I think there is some traction in getting non-Muslims to understand that Islamic finance is not a threat. And if I may, I will move on to the other question. But I have another anecdotal story which I'd like to share with you, and I'm conscious we want to leave about 15 minutes for online questions, so we've got about 10 more minutes. We're on track. Here's a very good one, it came from Fiji. Bless you in Fiji, thank you so much. How can the OIC member countries adopt a unified approach towards attaining the SDGs when they're heavily segregated on many levels of sectarian, economic, social, political, and/or human rights issues? Gosh, what a fabulous question, and gosh, I don't know the answer. If only I can share with you. I hear your concern, and all I can do is recommend to you that you all take a look at some wonderful research that has been done consistently over the last decade. It was first published, I think, in 2007 or 2008 by Professor Hossein Askari from George Washington University. It's called the Islamicity Index. The most recent Islamicity Index is published 2017, and you can find it at islamicityindex.org. And effectively what this does, it looks at 151 countries around the world and actually measures it using known economic and social data, and it lists hundreds of bits of, you know, publicly available documents which it uses, and it ranks every country in the world as to how advanced it is in achieving the objectives of the Maqasid. So it's looking at, you know, human life, faith, intellect, property, family, it's looking at economics, it's looking at so on and so forth. And what you will find very surprising there is that the first Muslim country, which is an OIC member, comes in at number 43. It's Malaysia. Top countries: New Zealand, Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland. UK at number 11, US at number 19, Singapore at number 25, even Israel is higher than any Muslim country at number 36 in upholding the values of the Maqasid Shariah. This is not about performing Hajj, praying 5 times a day, etc., etc. It's about freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of intellect, you know, democratic rights, transfer of property, etc., etc. You can look at the website and you'll see a really comprehensive review of this. Malaysia's at 43, UAE 47, Bahrain 67, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia comes in at number 88 in upholding the values of the Shariah, Maqasid al-Shariah. Lowest is the Yemen, of the 151. And I recommend you take a look at it. So we've got a big problem here because most of the OIC countries don't actually uphold the values of the Maqasid Shariah, if you look at this research. And you know, for me, the implications are, and there's a wonderful quote which you'll see on this website from Muhammad Abdul, who said, "I went to the West and saw Islam but no Muslims. I got back to the East and saw Muslims but no Islam." And I think we've got some fundamental issues and problems here, which I'm not going to dwell on, but it's a great question. Until we get some focus on actually understanding what the objectives of the Maqasid are, then we're not going to be able to change this. You know, we do have issues in terms of alignment with a global financial system or whatever else, but you know, where there's a will, there's a way. If we're not actually seen to be, you know, driving these values in terms of how we treat women, how we communicate through the media, you know, freedom of the press, property rights, ownership rights, transfers of property, you know, authoritarian rule, dictatorships and whatever else, we're not going to really address these questions. And maybe this is a topic for another conversation and another webinar in the future. But thank you, Fiji, for that question. Question 4, what is the role of NGOs and FinTech companies in achieving the SDGs, e.g. Red Cross, GlobalSadaqah? I mean, we put some great examples. And those of you who know me know I've been working for the last year and a half, and actually before, for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. I think the role is phenomenal. I think it, you know, great stuff is being done, and even more stuff can be done. It's about raising awareness, and it's building the case studies to share with you what can be done. Let me just tell you a brief story of something I worked on with the Federation of Red Cross. There is a very detailed case study on this which was written. You can go to the IFRC website and you can find it. It's related to a county in Kenya called Kitui, K-I-T-U-I. Kitui County was identified as a county in Kenya which would be most susceptible to climate change and drought. In fact, if you go there, the crops, the corn, maize, if you look at the fields there, everything's dead and there's no water. No water anywhere. The closest water is a river where kids and mums and the elderly tramp 14 kilometers round trip every day to get water. It's not particularly pure water. Oh, and by the way, some of the kids get taken by the crocodiles who live in the river. So no water, and the crops are failing, and climate change is coming in badly. They made an appeal through the Red Cross, and that appeal was listened to by the good people of one of the states of Malaysia, who had excess zakat money, and they wanted to contribute that zakat money to this appeal. They made no question at that stage about who it was going to. They just saw a humanitarian need, and that they were serving humanity by sending the money, and it was representing Islam as doing a good thing. Okay? As it actually turned out, 80% of the population of this county, of 1.2 million people, were non-Muslim. 20% were. Okay? But this didn't stop them from doing it. What did the money go to? Well, the Red Cross on the ground and with local community teams, which I had the privilege to work with, installed and repaired 30 deep borehole wells powered by solar power, solar pumps. So water was created, and it really meant that people didn't have to go 14 kilometers to get water. You had pumping stations and pipes in every village at a kiosk, and people could go and pay, you know, pay a small amount to get the water. And a small industry was created where people distributed the water on trucks, which was great. In addition to that, the money that was donated was used to purchase 2 kilograms of something called green gram grains, certified grains that had a 99.99% chance of fertilizing and growing, or germinating and growing, more than corn. In other words, these were hardy crops. They're kind of like lentils. They're a pulse, very nutritious, high in protein, and a cash crop. Value $1 per kilo. So we gave 180,000 families, actually 200,000 families, 2 kilos. $2. We didn't give them $2. We distributed, massive logistics exercise, distributing them. 3 months later, crop comes up. Climate change, still lots of stuff going on, pretty nasty, but these crops are resilient. Every family on average grew 180 kilos of this pulse. Cash value in the market, $180 US. What did they do with that money? Obviously, they put some money aside to buy the next set of grains to grow. They used it for healthcare, education, buying food and whatever else. But what did these communities do with the money? In meetings with the community that we had, we said, the community leaders said, we want to pay back the zakat money to Malaysia. These were non-Muslims. And zakat was given with the intention, and always should be given, that you put the person who's receiving it into the position, inshallah, in the future to be able to pay zakat themselves. Yeah. So these were non-Muslims saying, we want to pay the zakat back. The Malaysians said, well, you can't actually do that. But the Red Cross said, well, why don't you pay it back to us and we'll pass it on to the next county and we'll do a similar project. They actually did. They collected the money and they've installed water pipelines and done similar things. So the impact in Katui, 1.2 million lives saved. Next county, 1.4 million lives. So the impact of this for an NGO or for a global philanthropic organization is through innovation of using forecast-based financing for climate change, using sustainable crop analysis, and there's a wonderful research center here in Malaysia called Crops for the Future, which is coming up with lots of data about what survives under what conditions. Modern technology was used, but effectively on the ground, the solution was we gave $2 of grain and they all grew 180 and they decided to redistribute, pay it forward. Everybody was comfortable. But this makes a huge change. And if you think about that in terms of sustainability, you're not just giving sadaqah. You're giving sadaqah with dignity and making it sustainable. You're creating capital. So I think there's a very active role we can do. And what was amazing is that 80% of the population were Christians. And there was some friction because the races were competing for very scarce resources. Outcome in this community was they've helped each other out and it's been recognized. There is no religious tension anymore because everybody's in the same boat. They've survived and they're thriving. They're not making loads of money, but their lives are secure and they want to repeat and replicate the model. So I think that's an example of how you can do this. You just need to apply your mindset to it, think outside the box. Anyway, shall I stop there? And see if there are any questions. Oh, FinTech. Okay. Well, FinTech, gosh, got me on one of my favorite topics here. FinTech, I've already given an example, Arabesque, for example, in terms of the analysis it does, artificial intelligence. But there's also a lot can be done in terms of distribution. Many challenges, and I'll tell the story of, again, based on the Red Cross. The Red Cross partnered with an organization that provided FinTech technology for the distribution, and it was part of the donations went into a refugee camp in Lebanon of Syrian refugees. And you could see where your donation went. Not only the money being spent on a refugee, but which refugee and what they spent it on in the camp shops. So it was spent on cooking oil, it was spent on eggs, it was spent on flour or whatever else. So technology does provide you with this certainty of, I gave the money and this is where it went. It hasn't gone into some blob of administrative overheads or into somebody's back pocket. The company that provided the software for that and the technical capabilities to the IFRC, the founder of the company did it, and he was an investment banker. And he came out of his career in investment banking. He did get sponsorship once upon a time to run something like 3 or 4 marathons within a week. There is a competition there. And he trained for it, and he got loads and loads of sponsorship for running 3 or 4 marathons in a week. And lots of people gave him lots of money, and it was for a specific charity. And so therefore the story was, I'm running, I want to raise money, and it's going to this, I forget what it was, Children's Hospital. And everybody went, hooray. And he raised thousands and thousands of euros, tens of thousands of euros. And then he wanted to give the money, and he gave the money to the hospital for a specific purpose, he thought, but the Children's Hospital used it for something else. And he was absolutely gutted, because he, you know, people were asking, well, have they got the dialysis machine? Have they got this, that, and the other? But it had been used for some other purpose. And it so annoyed him that he said, I'm going to do something about this. There's no point in taking them to court or saying, I raise this money under false pretenses. He said, I'm going to come up with some FinTech software, which is actually going to prove, you know, source and utilization of funds. So that's what he worked on. I think FinTech has a huge role to play, because it makes life a lot simpler, and you can, it actually sadly brings the reality of many people's lives into your homes. I say sadly because it's quite shocking for many people. And there are people who take advantage of this in the wrong way, but in the main, people take advantage of it in the right way. It brings home the reality, and people spontaneously want to give a small amount. But they want to make sure it's going to the right place. Yeah. The other side, Arabesque, I think it's just the analysis of the data. We actually have an amazing amount of data out there, which if used for the right purposes, can really focus the attention on the right things at the right time. Whenever I'm asked what is Islamic finance, and I've become a little bit wiser on how I answer this over the last 10 years, I consistently answer in this way. Islamic finance is about the efficient and effective mobilization of capital and assets for the benefit of the real economy. People usually come back and engage with and say, can you define the real economy? And I go, yep. It's not the financial economy with all the speculation and derivative trading and whatever else. It's real economy. It's about real things being made, which by creating real jobs. It's building assets. It's mobilizing those assets. It's building schools and roads. It's actually impacting on daily lives, not on financially engineered things which just get traded between financial engineers and financial institutions. And that, I think, is what FinTech can provide.
Yeah, the link to the ground.
The link to the ground. It grounds it to reality. And I think the great thing NGOs and likes of the Red Cross and many others, and GlobalSadaqah and others can do, is you're actually doing projects on the ground, and you're building numerous case studies. You're creating case studies people look at and say, gosh, there's the impact. So you're relevant, you're building trust, and you're creating impact, which I'm afraid in the big world, if you look at governments, if you look at major corporations, sometimes the relevance, sometimes the trust, and sometimes the impact is, I'll use a big word, obfuscated. It's clouded. It's made difficult to see because of the politics of what's going on. But if you're actually working on the ground doing real stuff, and you can demonstrate this, this model can be used and reused, and people just take it, and it grows. The groundswell phenomenon is wonderful. Okay.
Right. Last question.
Last question. Oh.
Oh no, those are the 4 questions, right?
Oh, those are the 4 questions.
Oh, exactly on time, more or less.
So more or less on time. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions from people who are online. I don't know whether anybody's got any.
Okay, let's check on the questions. Sorry? Okay. All right, so for those of you who have questions, now's the time to ask. We'll try and answer as many as possible.
We'll try and get through as many as we can. If we can bundle some together. Excuse us whilst we play with the technology and try and look at it.
Let's start this. Okay. All right.
Here we go. Anonymous attendee, salam. Okay, and salam to you as well. But I think the SDGs should be merged with corporate vision and has its own tangible KPIs. I think that's a great observation, anonymous attendee. Bless you. This is a struggle, and I think it's going to be interesting how it's done. It will vary from culture to culture and from country to country. But you're starting to see more of it. I've just been working on a project for a UK-based company where I've done what's being called a sustainability audit. And we've come up, we've come up as a team with a number of recommendations about what they can do in terms of inculcating the SDGs into their day-to-day processes, educating staff with the outcomes and so on. So I think it's heading in that direction. And you should see the public demanding to see the KPIs of the corporation, and their expectation will be to see, well, which one of the 17 are you impacting and how have you impacted it? The next question there, do you think IFI should have an SDG screening in addition to Sharia screening? Yes.
It should be across the board?
I think it should be across the board. You know, we're looking now at a global crisis situation here in climate change, although there are some deniers, not stating the obvious. You know, we have some real issues here. I mean, the recent report produced by the UN with regards to sustainability in Malaysia, some really, really worrying data where effectively children in lower cost housing districts here are not getting the nourishment they need and are unlikely to live as long as their parents, or to receive, they've got 1 in 5 children in Malaysia has stunted growth. Now 1 in 5, 20% in this. And effectively what this is saying is that children born today are not going to live as long as their parents, and they're not going to have the opportunity because they're not getting the same nutrients. And we need to understand the difference between calorific value and getting the nutrients in order to create the brain power. So I think that we have to head in this direction. We have to have a consciousness. I don't think there's a sort of separation. If you're an Islamic financial institution, yes, you're going to have Sharia there, but this is just an extension. It's a complement to Sharia. It's something that we should be doing.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
So given that many Muslim countries, even Malaysia, especially the Middle East, a large portion of the economy depends on or is based on oil.
Yeah.
And if we start looking at the environment, then that's going to be an industry that's flagged or not aligned with the SDGs. So is that going to be a big barrier in the first place, or do you think it can be overcome?
Well, I think it can be overcome. But it will be a big barrier. I mean, you look at how much oil money, and it's not just the Middle East. You have challenges in Brunei, even Malaysia has oil revenues. It really does mean a complete rethink, and the challenge I think really comes down to a fundamental question: is the politicians being brutally honest with their people to say, we can't keep going and growing in this way. The metrics has always been about GDP and growth. Perhaps they're the wrong metrics. We should be looking at sustainability. So 360-degree assessment, and some of the metrics, the accounting firms and on are looking at sustainability quotients to say, is a government, is a country actually on track with this? So you don't measure by GDP growth. You actually move by quality of life, sustainability impact, no negative impact, trying to keep carbon neutral, etc., etc., and educating the children, from the ground up, from primary school onwards, to say, well, these are the sort of metrics that we should be looking at. What do you think would be? I'm looking at this one. What do you think would be the biggest challenge in achieving the SDGs from an Islamic finance perspective? I think the biggest challenge is twofold. One is effective communication and understanding, education about everybody's in the same boat and we're sharing the same risk, and that we need to communicate that. And the second thing is building up a collaborative network where we actually get focused on solving the problem. And this is where I'm intrigued. Working on this project in Kenya was a real eye-opener. I've been in financial services and consulting all my life, and yes, I've rolled my sleeves up and got down to basic levels. And in my personal time, I've done charitable and philanthropic things, working in the slums in Sao Paulo in Brazil, because I happened to be stationed there. But it wasn't until I was actually working on this project in Kenya and seeing the enthusiasm of the people who are helping, who aren't much better off than the people they're helping. So the Red Cross volunteers there, looking at the communities and looking at how the communities collaborate and discuss this, and the wisdom that comes from the elders and so on. You're just sitting there. You know, people were saying, oh, they should open an Islamic bank. You can tell them how to do it. And I said, I think the last thing they need is an Islamic bank. What they need is community cooperatives, you know, where they, you know, exchange surplus and do some valuable things. And that's exactly what's working there. So I think it's ground up stuff. I think what we'll see, my honest opinion is you'll see the ground up pushing the top to change. That wonderful young lady who spoke about climate change, the 15-year-old from Greta, I'm trying to remember her last name, who spoke at the climate change conference, with a 15-year-old Swedish girl who basically said, don't you dare let us down again. You have let us down, pointing at me and all my generation. You know, you know, you've had your chance, please, yeah, please take over. I see we've got a 5-minute warning coming up and we're trying to get through. How current debt-based Islamic banking can help in achieving? Well, oh God, that's a tricky one. I mean, the answer is yes, they can if they're focused. I have some reservations about having too much debt, because debt in a fiat-based system creates more problems. So we're talking about, you know, on the one hand, fundamentally changing the financial system, which is a much bigger issue and maybe something we can talk about at another webinar. But yeah, we've got what we've got, and simply put, I think we should focus the attention on measuring the impact on sustainability, even if they are debt-based instruments. Anonymous, lots of anonymous people. Yeah. Oh, I missed that one. How do you see gender equality is in line with the Maqasid Shariah? Well, I look at it this way. I think there are a lot of local interpretations in Islam where women appear to be disadvantaged. But I don't think that's the intention. I think you know, the view is that there is an equal and proper role for both women and men to play. What I really get concerned about now in the modern age. So I think, in essence, my understanding of Islam is that there isn't, you know, that there isn't a prescription that says you are not equal to somebody else. You just have different roles to play because you are genetically equipped differently. Okay, and that's the fundamental basis of it. I think in the modern day and age, what we do see are negative perceptions around oppression of women in certain environments, where that's more of a tribal custom than anything to do with Islam. And it does concern me. I mean, many things concern me, but it concerns me that women don't get an equal voice. You know, I refuse to sit on manels, you know, which is all male panels. I signed a pledge, which I was encouraged to do by Dr. Zeti and by Dr. Jamila Mahmood a number of years ago, where I just don't do it. And people say, oh, you ought to do it because people want to hear your opinions. And I say, well, yes, but there are plenty, if you think about it hard enough, there are plenty of capable women who could also be on the panel and have a really interesting discussion. So I don't think we should be going down a route which says this is mutually exclusive and we cannot do it. I think we have to you know, adapt and accept that we've got 50% of the world's population are female, and they're included in this. Yes. And they are an important part of the solution. If you just look, from my experience in working in East Africa, most of the driving force to get stuff done in the community, I mean, the men aren't bad, you know, they look like they're giving the orders, but the women are the ones who are really driving this stuff and making it happen. And that's where the change. You look at what was done in you know, the early versions in Bangladesh with Grameen. Yeah, it was mainly females, and they always paid back. So,
we have time for one last question. Yeah, time's up. We'll answer
one more.
This one about Sharia Advisory Committee and the one about education. Oh, which do you prefer?
Well, I can't follow this. What is the role of educational in changing the mindset of prioritizing over profit? What is the role of educational institutions in changing the mindset of prioritizing SDGs over profit? Absolutely mission critical. We've got to change the attitude. You know, I was involved in a useful experiment with my own children, starting 15 years ago, where somebody came to the school and said, we'd like to teach your children about financial sustainability and financial literacy. And I looked at the syllabus. They were 6 years old, my youngest. it looked great. And I said, what about Islamic finance? And they said, well, we haven't got an expert. I said, you have now. And they put it in there. So Islamic finance got embedded. And I saw in this prototype, which was run in Malaysia, kids from 25 countries at this international school understood the values of risk sharing without understanding it was Islamic finance, but through play and through education. And they've all grown up. My own children, who none of them want to be involved in finance, they're all involved in lots of different things, they understand concepts of risk sharing. So I think if you start young and you get people in tune with this stuff and you educate them, then that's where the fundamental change comes. Hopefully we've got time and of a generation to change the system, but the young people really get this stuff and should be allowed to get it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sad we ran out of time. Gosh, an hour went by so very quickly.
Well, time moves very quickly when you're having fun. And really, this was very interesting. I didn't even interrupt because I didn't want you to stop. So, alhamdulillah, 1 hour has passed. Hope it has been valuable and useful for all of you. We will be sharing this and posting this recording on our website, ethiscrowd.com/webinar, right? And inshallah, see you next month. And thank you again so much for coming down and making time. And inshallah, we'll
great pleasure.
More sessions.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone.